But before we do that, Philip, do you know what?
No, what, Dwayne?
We need to jump down the rabbit hole. Let's go. Come on. All right, here we are in the rabbit hole. And this is a bit of a different one, Philip, because you know what's coming, because I posted up on our group page a couple of days ago
Yes, you
a
let other
question.
people know. You let other people know what the rabbit hole topic is, just never me.
Yeah, you saw the message, didn't you? You
I
saw
did.
it.
I was
Yeah.
very
So
pleased.
yeah, so this topic is, well, I'll read it straight from the message that I put in our group, because we've got some comments back from listeners too, which we're going to share with you and get some thoughts from you too, David, hopefully. Has there been any episode of Doctor Who, whether on TV or audio, that you absolutely despised when you first heard or saw it, but now you think it's a work of genius? And why do you think that? And I was inspired to ask that question because I was watching The Happiness Patrol, and that was a story that I absolutely hated. And I was watching it with my kids the other day, just with my eyes almost rolling, just thinking how wonderful it was. And particularly, it could be a wonderful audio story too, that story. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. Philip, is there any stories that stand out for you in that when I asked that question?
Well, it was interesting because you immediately went to the Happiness Patrol, and so my thinking was classic series, and there's no classic series episode I despised or hated on first viewing. So my immediate thought was no, and I think I answered no in the group. But I actually thought about it a bit more. There are more recent stories that I have not enjoyed. I think despise is a strong word. But some of them I've actually never gone back to watch again. So there's a couple of seasons where I've only ever seen the show once. And my daughter, who I watched a lot with would doubt that too, because we got them very early in the morning in Australia.
Oh,
And so I used to get up early in the morning and watch them when they first got onto ABC iView. And so my daughter says, actually, I haven't actually seen a lot of them because I slept through large chunks of it because I was quite bored. So I actually haven't been back and seen some of those. In terms of reflection, though, I've recently rewatched all the Peter Capaldi stories,
mm.
and some of them on the way through I didn't enjoy that much. But having gone back and watched them again, they've actually have improved a lot. So I actually think I was too harsh on some of the Peter Capaldi stories on the way through, and I've actually revised my thinking about them. I didn't despise them on the way through, but they actually were a lot more better ones in there, and actually some really good ones in there that don't spring to mind when I first think of Top Doctor Who. But he's actually superb. And watching him act again and what he did, actually, I totally underestimated Peter Capaldi as a Doctor, and I've revised him totally. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'll take that answer.
Good.
Absolutely. All right. We'll come to you in a moment, David, but I'll read a comment or two and see what the three of us think of these. Kieran Moffat says, Kinder. As a kid, the dream sequences bothered me, not to mention Nissa being regulated to the TARDIS. But as an adult, I find myself continually blown away by Simon Rouse's haunting, an accurate portrayal of a man suffering, a nervous breakdown. Honourable mention to The Beast Below, which I watched last weekend for the first time since transmission and thoroughly enjoyed. Yeah, Kinder's an interesting one. What are your thoughts on those comments there, David?
Yeah, I think the stories that we saw as children and how that can change over time. But they're the ones when similar. I don't think there's any Doctor Who story I absolutely despised, but they're the ones that I didn't like much. And I remember as a kid, some of the stories I just didn't really like, and some ones I didn't get through. The Time Meddler was one. You know, in the 90s, there's a TV channel called UK Gold that used to do all the Doctor Who's. Originally was like Tom Baker episodes on weekday nights, just individually, and then they had the omnibuses on the weekend. And that's how I got into Doctor Who. That's how I first saw it. And Tom Baker was my first. I loved all the Tom Baker stories, and then I was fascinated to go back to all the other eras. But I found particularly like the historical stories were ones that at that time I wasn't as keen on. I remember trying to watch The Time Meddler a couple of times and just not really getting it, finding it very slow and giving up around about part 2 when the Doctor disappears. I think the Romans I also just didn't get, and they just didn't grab me. Now I absolutely love the historical stories. I love those two stories in particular. Time Meddler's my favourite Hartnell. You know, I love them. I love the wit. I love the intelligence in the scripts, of the character interaction. I think when you're like sort of 8 or 9, 10, and you kind of you like the monsters chasing people down the corridors, they don't have as much to offer. Now, I the monster stuff, yeah, I enjoy that, sure, but I would rather have some great character actors sitting in a room and having a great conversation. And I love those stories. And actually, one story, of course, one of the all-time classics and one of my favourites now, but one story I really did not like when I first saw it was City of Death, which, of course, the pinnacle of the Douglas Adams time and season 17 and all that. First time I watched it, very, very young, probably at 11 or 12, and I just didn't get it. I just thought it was quite, what's going on? Why are these people just standing around having these long conversations? Why aren't they just shooting each other and get it over with? Now, of course, you know, later on I rewatched it, later teens, and now you go, oh, of course it's genius. Of course it's superlative. It's beautiful. Everything about it is wonderful. But I think those stories which grow up, yeah, really we come to love later on as adults. So some, maybe those are the slightly talkiest stories, the ones with the themes that we just not plugged into when we're kids. And then as they, over time, you really start to enjoy them and appreciate what they were doing, and equally possibly understand why the historicals didn't do well with kids at the time, which is a shame. But I guess if you've seen 12 episodes of the Daleks, you don't necessarily want 4 episodes of Catholics versus Protestants in historical France. But hey, I like that story now, but I didn't see it in the 60s when I was 6 years old. So, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Time Meddler always had a mystique about it to me. When I eventually got to see it, I was somewhat surprised, but it was the Target novelization that I read first of the Time Meddler, and the cover of the monk, just the monk on the cover is nothing like he is in the TV serial, but that image grabbed me, and that sort of imprinted itself on my mind. So it's yeah, I've always said the Time Meddler is my favorite, but I don't know, maybe I change from time to time with my favorites with that particular era. Very, very interesting. Shall we go to another comment, Philip?
Let's.
Alex Pass says, Delta and the Bannermen. As a kid, I thought it was silly and full of all that lovey-dovey stuff. Watching again some 30 years later, it was a great laugh, though myself and my daughter still found the romance a bit cringy.
Dirty Dancing.
Dirty Dancing?
Well, it's set in the same sort of, you know, theme parky, you know, everyone goes away and stays at campsite in lodges, and it's the same sort of location, just an American version with romance.
But I was like Heidi High as well. So I didn't see Heidi High until after I'd seen Delta and the Bannermen, and then it sort of translates back to that. So
Hody Ho.
Yeah, that went for years, that show, didn't it? Went for basically all the 80s.
I'm not sure it was very good, though, now think about it, but I do remember watching it a lot.
Actually, let me talk about my story, the Happiness Patrol, and what I still don't really relate too much to the Margaret Thatcher satire side of things. But what I really love about this is the richness of every single character that comes in, and there are a lot of them, a lot of those amazing characters. And if you've watched those classic years of Doctor Who, you'll notice through the 80s, there's lots of different faces from throughout the 80s up to that point that are in the Happiness Patrol, you know, sort of flashbacks to Gaze of Androzani and Frontios and, you know, other bits and pieces as well. But I was thinking to myself that this would make a great audio too. So it's really confined, studio-based story, which would really lend itself well to audio. However, probably the large cast may make it a bit tricky for the kind of audio we're used to listening to these days. You'd probably have some thoughts on the size of the cast of the Happiness Patrol as far as audio goes, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think there's something absolutely to that. It's you know, as we know, the fewer characters on audio, the easier it is to juggle in your head. And the Happiness Patrol, like a lot of those McCoy stories, they have expanded casts of people who sort of pop in for the odd little scenes and wander away again. I mean, I think Battlefield kind of like sticks half its cast on a jeep and drives them away in partway episode 3, going, we don't know what to do with you. There are too many people here. But it's interesting. I think the Happiness Patrol and Delta and the Bannermen as well. These are stories which I think, whereas I said sometimes as a child you saw stories that maybe you just didn't connect with and seemed boring, and now they're great. This is the other side, stories that just seemed a bit too silly, and especially, I love Happiness Patrol. I love Delta and the Bannerman. I think they are terrific, funny, subversive, weird stories. That there's I can't imagine any other television program having episodes like Delta and the Bannerman and Happiness Patrol, let alone series which then could switch to a totally different tone the following week. But I think they're very rich and exciting stories. But I say that as somebody who sort of came to them in later teens and now appreciates them as an adult. And, I think if I can sit down and watch a Happiness Patrol and go, oh, wonderful, fun, Candyman, brilliant. I don't have to go to school the next day and meet like school bullies who I said, were you watching Doctor Who last night? Were you watching that rubbish with that stupid robot made sweet? And getting attacked there. And I remember a lot of people, I think a lot of people who took against the Happiness Patrol at the time were people who might have still been at school at the time and had to face this inquisition the following day in a way that when I was at school, I got into Doctor Who when I was like 8 or 9, 10, and I very much kept it to myself. It was only I was just too late to appreciate the renaissance of Doctor Who as something that you could talk about openly with Christopher Eccleston's series and onwards. That came out when I was I left school and I was at college. So I just missed out, and I just thought, I'm so glad that there are children who are going to be able to grow up enjoying Doctor Who can talk about it. And it's cool, and all the other kids are watching it too, and they can actually have a great time with Doctor Who and not get attacked by the bullies for it, like what I did growing up. So I think that's a huge thing. You as a child, you want your show to be serious and important, and sometimes the best way to be serious and important is to be very, very silly, or to be silly on the surface, like the Happiness Patrol, which is ludicrous but has some very serious messages. And the ending with Helen A, crying, the Doctor looking over her, and the camera panning back is an amazing sort of final confrontation with the villain. There's nothing else quite like that in TV Doctor Who. But if you're 7,
and the blues going through too.
Absolutely, yeah.
The thing with me though is that when this was shown in Australia, it was shown at 5:30 in the afternoon as part of a magazine-style program called The Afternoon Show. And the presenter, James Valentine, all us fans of our vintage Philip remember James Valentine. He hated the Sylvester McCoy era. In fact, I don't think he had much time for Doctor Who at all anyway.
No,
but when season 24 came on, he would rip into it after the end of every episode. And in particular, the Happiness Patrol episode 1, I remember the credits finishing, the camera shot going back to James Valentine, and he was just shaking his head with his eyes closed and going, what is going on here? And my dad was there with me too, watching it, and he was laughing. So I had this feeling of complete embarrassment and shame over the top of me over this brilliant show that I was hugely devoted to in my own mind and my own life. And it had kind of been reduced to this. So it really stung for a long time. But
my experience with Happiness with Patrol was the opposite, because my parents always hated Doctor Who, couldn't understand why I watched it. But my mother walked in during the second episode and went, "Are they making fun of Maggie Thatcher?" Because she hated Maggie Thatcher, and so she immediately picked up on what was going on and the performance, and she went, "Oh well, yeah, good to see the Doctor's doing something useful then." So yeah, my experience was the opposite, because my parents really loved the fact that they were being political and having a go.
That's interesting that we've all got sort of parents figuring very much in their early Doctor Who memories, because I got into Doctor Who, my mum watched it as a child, and she grew up with like Troughton and Pertwee and Early Tom, and it was just we were watching some other programs, and then we were having a chat afterwards, and then Tom Baker's title sequence came on, and she said, "Oh, this is Doctor Who. I used to watch this with your uncle when we were kids. Oh, I think you'd like it. It's quite funny. It's got monsters and this clever alien who travels in time. And okay, and it was Robot episode 2, and I watched it and loved it. And then the next day, there's a cliffhanger at the end. He's going to be killed by a robot, and the next day was episode 3, so I had to tune in to watch it, and I loved it. But it's very much like that. I think if I'd been watching and Doctor Who came on, my mum said, "Oh, this was rubbish. I hated this. I probably would never have bothered to watch it." But that's a formative thing. I can imagine if you're watching something and then your father behind you starts laughing in a slightly mocking way. I can imagine that being lacerated on your heart. That's a huge memory, especially if it sounds very unprofessional conduct for a presenter on the television to be going, "Oh, I hate this." God, Lord, I'm surprised they allowed it, but hey.
Oh, it's the ABC. You've got to be unbiased.
Um, as far as audio goes, probably one that I found a little confusing to start with, but now it's one of my favorites of all time, would have to be Zagreus. When at the time that it came out, I've been through this before on the show. How we talked to Gary Russell about it last year as well for the anniversary, and yeah, it was a strange one to start with. But when you go back and revisit it, I love it more and more every time I listen to it, and I get more out of it every time. It's one of those ones I can just keep going back to when I've got about 10 hours to spare because it's that long. But yeah, I love that one. But Dale Watts here in the comments says about audio, he said maybe Live 34 was, he says he hated it the first time, but loved it the second time, then thought it was just okay the third time. So he hated it, liked it, went back a bit. So he's probably cancelled himself out, he says. I think I was probably in the mood. It was the mood I was in each time. It seemed corny on first listen and really clever the next. It's probably both. And Live 34 is an example of what, a Big Finish doing experimentation. And I thought it's been years since I've heard it, and I've been meaning to go back and listen to it again. But I love that kind of experimentation that Big Finish does. Zagreus was similar. And The Natural History of Fear, those kind of experimental stories are really good too. So, Philip, did you have any audios that, because we've talked about some that we've gone into Randomoids episodes and you've gone, I don't think I like this one, and then you listen to it again and you get more out of it.
I keep being surprised how often I do go back and listen again and go, oh, actually, that's much better. Live 34, I didn't enjoy much the first time, but I had a re-listen recently, and I did all the Ace and Hex stories, and so re-listened on that listen through, and actually I really enjoyed it. It was actually a lot cleverer than I thought. The other one that I like, I still lots of people don't like, is the one set in Ibiza. Dance
The Rapture.
Party. The Rapture. And The Rapture, the first time I listened to that, didn't enjoy it at all. And then went back and listened to it again a couple of years later, and again more recently. And actually, every time I listen to that, I find more in that I like. There's a lot of stuff on the side which doesn't quite feel canon, but I think they're experimenting too far. But I actually really like what they've done characterization wise, and that always appeals to me. But yeah, I keep being surprised by, I pull faces when we pull some things out randomly, and then go back and listen again with a different mindset, because I'm listening to, see what I can get out of this, and make notes, and suddenly there's a lot more in it. I think often we can listen too quickly and in an unprepared way, and you've got to remember these are plays, and I think we often forget. It's not just throw on podcast, though our podcast is fantastic. It's not just throw on podcast and do the washing up and wander around the house. They're written as plays, and some in particular, the language. And if you don't stop and prepare, when you walk to a theatre, you walk in, you sit down, the lights dim, you're prepared for what's about to happen, which could be anything. I think sometimes I just stick something on the headphones and keep going my merry way, and I just miss too much. So when I actually go back and actually give it the effort it deserves, the time it deserves, and the space it deserves, I get a lot more out of it.
Yeah, and it's that magic 101 to 200 in the monthly range, isn't it? That we kind of we'd had enough in our Big Finish catalog where we'd listen to the first 100 over and over again, but by that stage we're only listening to them once because they were coming out more regularly, and there were spin-offs and things like that as well. So going back to that 100, the 100 to 200 always surprises me. Yeah. Sorry, David.
No, it's going to mean Doctor ideally should be a very broad church of styles and tones, and I think those experimental ones, like the Rapture and Natural History of Fear, and some of these Scherzo, some of these stories which when I first heard them, I got into Big Finish probably in my mid-teens. I think I was around about there. I think it was in my early to mid-teens, and my first one was Storm Warning, and sort of went on from there, picking them up when I could, because didn't have too much money, but I bought them here and there, especially those early McGanns. I remember when Zagreus came out, and I tried to listen to as many McGanns as I could in preparation for it. But the experimental ones are, I'm just so glad they exist. They're lots of fun. Like the Rapture in some areas, I'm sure it isn't. It's very different from other stories, but it's one which I listened to and thought, you know what, aspects of this maybe I do differently or whatever. But it's a very brave and original storyline, tackling sort of themes that hadn't really been done much in Doctor Who at that time, and certainly it feels very new series. Of course, in sort of its sensibilities, it's doing a lot of things before the new series have come along and said, "Oh, we could actually do a lot of these other sort of themes as well, and delve into sort of depression and anxiety and that kind of thing." I remember sometimes, I'm trying to think, because many of the writers of Big Finish I see and socialised with, but let's take Rob Shearman, because Rob Shearman has been fantastic stories. He's only done like half a dozen or so for a Big Finish, and they're all fantastic. But I remember listening to, I think it was Jubilee the first time round in my sort of early teens, listening to it, not quite getting it. And because I was a teenager and therefore not a sensible person, and because I had Rob Shearman's email address, I thought I'd email Rob Shearman to say, I just listened to Jubilee, and I just thought, it was very long, and I didn't really quite understand but I really like this bit, and I remember talking about the bit of this entirely huge, layered, rich, complex, deep story about sort of propaganda and time and the way that we sort of reconceptualize sort of evil and then mock it and then become it and distort and all this. The bit I got out of it at that time was, I think there's a scene where the Doctor yells at the Dalek and says, "Once you've exterminated everything and there's nothing left, what will you do?" And for some reason, I thought that was the most sort of profound moment. And I said that to Rob Shearman. I remember sort of saying, being, in that way that only a live teenager can, being entirely dismissive of the other themes of that story and going, "Yeah, I don't really understand all the stuff about blah, 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 but I really like this bit," and sent it off. And to his credit, I have seen Robert Shearman a few years ago and met him properly first time. We had a wonderful chat. He's an absolutely lovely, supportive, talented, witty man. And fortunately, he had no recollection of that, I'm sure, irritating email that teenage David sent him. And I'm very glad of that, because Jubilee is a fantastic, utterly wonderful story. But yeah, the first time I got it, I just went, "Oh, I don't know. These other people seem to think it's brilliant, but I don't. So I'm going to tell them." And I go, No, I'm deeply embarrassed by that. Deeply embarrassed. But I thought I'd leap on one of these, the absolute classics, an unassailable classic, rather than sort of give one of the experimental ones a bit of a kicking, because I thought, Chimes of Midnight, brilliant story. First time I listened to that, I didn't understand the plot or the time paradox stuff, and I went, I don't like that. Well, and I listen to it and gone, what are you talking about? Of course it's brilliant. It's rich and moody and exciting and funny, and yeah, it's odd. I say how they hit you, whether you were sat down and fully prepared and immersed in it, or whether you were really thinking about something else and you missed something. You've really got to devote a fair bit of attention to them to pick up on these details, especially with those really rich stories, the experimental ones that do something unusual.
Yep,
absolutely. Let me run through a few more comments. I'll run through them reasonably quickly now for the sake of time. But we got a bit of a novel from our friend Will Hadcroft, who joined in on the conversation. Will has released an audio story on BBC Audio called The Resurrection Plant. That was a couple of years ago now. I think he's got another one on the way. I think. You have to correct me if I'm wrong, Will. He says, "I have several. I agree with Kieran regarding Kinder at age 11 3/4. It's very precise, Will. I was struggling with the departure of Tom Baker and the fact that Peter Davison was playing the Doctor like an ordinary human being. I was unnerved by Tegan in the Dark Realm and those strange characters, but thought the story extremely boring for the most part. Now, though, I appreciate the concepts of the need to eliminate egotism and divisive ambition and how human nature goes through cycles. On my last viewing, I was struck by the serenity of Hindle and Sanders, having been pushed by the Kinder to breaking point, and how they advised Earth not to proceed with colonization. An extremely thoughtful and considered script. And I'm with Alex on Delta and the Bannerman. On broadcast, I was 17 and heavily preoccupied with whatever they do next will either make it or break it. So Sylvester McCoy's initial Buster Keaton-inspired performances left me dismayed, and Andrew Cartmell, in my eyes, had refreshed the series style in entirely the wrong way. Delta did nothing to reassure me. I found much of it embarrassing, but years later, when I was suffering with depression, a friend recommended watching it because it's light in tone. I did so and was delighted by most of it. I was chuckling away at the two hopeless American spies and noted how some aspects, like the Navarinos, seemed to point forward to 2005 and the RTD era. Finally, for years, I believed Ghostlight was all gloss and no substance. I thought the cast, sets, and costumes were splendid, but the script was incoherent gibberish. The public would reject it and the series would be cancelled for sure. I was so relieved when Fenric followed it. However, after watching an interview with Andrew Cartmel detailing the ideas behind it, I found my rewatch very absorbing and intriguing. I still think the script doesn't clearly explain the relationship between Josiah, Light, and Control, but having heard Cartmel talk about it, I see it and appreciate it. So thanks, Will, for that extensive comment. Lots of Sylvester McCoy getting mentioned in this topic today. Steve Panozzo says, weirdly, all the stories I despised, I pretty much feel the same about today. None of them have redeemed themselves in the fullness of time. Shoddy performances, poor production values, and crap sets, if anything, look worse with the passage of time. Where I've changed my mind is in misjudging Enemy of the World based on what it was, until recently, the lone surviving episode. In viewing the story in its entirety, I went from being rather dull and unremarkable to being one of the top adventures of the Troughton era. I used to be rather ambivalent towards Invasion of the Dinosaurs, but that was out of ignorance of having listened to fan advice rather than see it for myself, which I did much later. So I have to echo the comments on Enemy of the World. When that was found, that was an amazing piece of television, one of the most amazing, like not just Doctor Who, but 60s television across the board, I think. It was up there with, what the Avengers was doing, and they were throwing lots of money at their production too. So I have to agree there. And our good friend Teresa Phillip says that the first time I've watched Time and the Rani, there you go, another Seventh Doctor, I thought it was nonsensical and confusing, which almost made it unwatchable for me. But then I rewatched it and I realized there were some things that weren't too bad. I realized Sylvester McCoy was a great actor in his first role as the Doctor. Kate O'Mara's impersonation of Mel, which was funny. Kev McCulloch's incidental music was pretty good. That's one way of describing it, Teresa. And I love the design of the Lacurtians. I don't mind the plot. Interesting concept. The only letdown was Mel's screams. I've got to admit they got to me a little bit too. But as there's a little bit more conversation in that thread on that question too, about the fact that it was originally supposed to be a Sixth Doctor story. It was offered to Colin Baker to come back and do. He refused. So the Seventh Doctor was sort of jammed in there into the story. A lot of things were changed during that time. So the Seventh Doctor, he was quite redeemed, I think, over the years in a lot of people's eyes.
I think that the Seventh Doctor suffered from fear of cancellation. I think after the Colin Baker hiatus, what a bizarre word that only Doctor Who fans use. Hiatus.
Yes.
Only Doctor Who fans ever use that word. Anyhow, I think when Doctor Who came back, every Doctor Who fan was in panic of the show being cancelled forever. And so I think everyone judges those 4 years really harshly, and they're looking at everything in a minute detail. And I think that Colin's, the Trial of the Time Lord and the Sylvester's seasons really get judged differently, because is this going to end Doctor Who forever? And I think that we went through going through that fear of what will everyone think? Will the BBC cancel the show next? I think we judged that at the time, and still maybe a bit too really harshly. Now it's come back and it's safe. We're happy, but we were living in fear at the time of cancellation, and I think that we judged the shows a lot more because of that.
I think there's the context of, and I always find there are a lot of things which are, even some Doctor Who stories that I watched and didn't like initially, when I returned to later, I enjoyed much more, because you could put it into a context, which is, if this isn't the version of the show that's on right now, or the version that's done, it's a, you can look back on any Doctor's era and go, if you like a story or don't like a story, it doesn't make any difference to what it's doing right now, because it's now safely in the past, and you can appreciate things for what they are trying to do and how they're different from other things around them, as opposed to it being the version of the show which is on right now, therefore the de facto version. It's got to be perfect in every way. It's got to not only be perfect for the British viewing public and the international viewing public, it's also got to be perfect for me and everything I specifically want the show to be doing. And if it isn't, but once it's in the background, you can pick up a story that you might not have liked and gone, oh, it's Doctor Who doing that. Fair enough, and appreciate what it's doing on those scores. I remember you at the beginning mentioned the Capaldi era, which I remember watching, thinking that Matt Smith's Doctor was is still my favourites. I loved Matt Smith, absolutely fantastic. And I think I had the very sort of first twinge of what Doctor Who fans of old used to say when it's like, I love John Pertwee, and then Tom turned up, and I went, oh, what's this? That's a bit weird. So when I adored Matt Smith all the time, then Capaldi turned up, an actor I loved already, but because the Doctor was now much darker and moodier, and I went, oh, I wasn't certain of some of those Capaldi stories at the time, and then revisited and thought, this is what was I talking about? This is exceptional television. Like the sheer layer, the performance, the scripts. It's complex, it's different, it's moody. It might not have been maybe when I first watched what I wanted on that night. Maybe on a sort of Saturday night, I wanted something a bit lighter and peppier. But in the times I've watched the Capaldi era, in the context of what it's doing, I thought, this is exceptional stuff. We were lucky to have this wonderful vision of the show and everyone making it. But that context, I think, is really, really important, especially when I can imagine the Sylvester McCoy era. I think when I was first on Doctor Who forums before the show came back, McCoy bashing and McCoy hating was still a thing. It was still a huge way for people who just hated the McCoy era. And that's really, from what I can see, disappeared, quite thankfully. And it disappeared quite quickly once the show came back and people appreciated it as its own era. And now I think when I see people, like, when season 24 got released on Blu-ray, people said, oh, I won't be buying that. Time in the Rani, eye roll. And I went, oh, is there really a place for this sort of mean-spirited? It's sold
out fast, it's fine.
It's lovely television, like, fine. But the idea of, oh, I hate Time in the Rani, I hate Paradise Towers, I think, that's kind of fallen out of favour, hasn't it? It's another era of the show. There are so many eras of the show. They're all got strengths and weaknesses. And if you want light-hearted fun, but full of ideas off the wall, not like anything else you've ever seen before, those 4 stories of season 24 do that. They fulfill that remit of being like nothing else on television before or since. And it's certainly not my favourite season, but if necessary, if a gun to my head, I could put together a defence that says it's the best season of Doctor Who there's ever been. And I'd like to think I could do that for every season. But for that season, that's what I think of season 24. And I'm glad people like it now. And I'm glad people love Delta and the Bannermen, because it's great.
Excellent. I think my feeling at the time during that era was not so much the fear of it going, but the disbelief that it could have possibly stopped after season 26, because I thought it was that good. It had improved so much. I thought, how can anyone possibly cancel it now after there's been such an improvement in my mind? But of course, we know now that, the bigwigs weren't really paying any attention to it at all anyway. So that throughout the whole time that was going, I think, who was it that said that he thought it was cancelled the whole time? Didn't even know it was on anymore. Michael Grade. It was Michael Grade.
Yeah.
He said, wasn't it cancelled?
Yeah.
Anyway. All right. That's been a great rabbit hole topic, gentlemen. Thank you very much for sharing that with me. No guns down here in the rabbit hole, so we won't hold anything to your head, David, and get you to do that. So we will jump out of the rabbit hole now and talk a bit more in depth to you directly. If you enjoyed what you heard in this clip from the Sirens of Audio podcast, be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss out on another episode from us. And if you want to find out more about us, including our back catalogue of episodes, you can head over to sirensofaudio.com.